From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. On the brief today, Sophie Cameroudin in Hong Kong on the mounting human and economic toll of the coronavirus. Maria Tadeo in Brussels on the EU budget talks, and Bill Ferries in Washington on the U.S. reaching toward a peace deal with the Taliban. So let's start, first of all, with Sophie Cameroudin, of course, over in Hong Kong. Give us the latest. There are different numbers bouncing around. Do we have a sense of the numbers or even the methodology at this point, Sophie?
Well, these shifting numbers, David, certainly magnifying just how China is managing the outbreak. Hubei revising its case count once again this Friday, as some cities in the province had to include write-offs that were made for February 19th. And Hubei also revised its February 20th numbers, pushing the confirmed case count above 63,000. Plus, prisons are also now being included for reporting, with clusters discovered in China's third biggest province of Shandong as well, which the central government said will be investigated. So Shandong now has a total of 748 cases, and the outbreak has affected industrial and port activity in the eastern province. And now, according to Bloomberg Economics, the economy in China this week running at about 50 to 60% of its normal capacity, but authorities just aren't seeing a turning point yet when it comes to the epidemic. And so, in the Politburo's meeting this week, it indicated it would deepen the focus on stabilizing the economy. This, as we're seeing the impact on global supply chains and business sentiment, which is showing up in global PMI data. U.S. business and manufacturing activity, for example, looking sluggish, with businesses hesitant to place orders. We're also seeing a pickup in cases outside of China, which could indicate a new phase in the outbreak. The surge in Iran, in particular, raising red flags for the WHO, given the concerns around infections not being traced back directly to China. David.
Really quite a disturbing story. Thank you so much to Sophie Cameroudin over in Hong Kong. And now we go to Brussels and Maria Tadeo, where they're trying to hash out a budget over there. What are the issues? As I understand it, there are hawks and doves involved, Maria?
Well, there's many issues, and this is day 2 of a very long summit already. And just to give you some context, European leaders are trying to get to a compromise over the budget for the European Union for the next 7 years. We're talking about 1 trillion euros. And the obvious question here is who is going to pay for what, and what is this money going to be used for? And adding to tensions, of course, and this has to be agreed unanimously by 27 countries, is the fact that the United Kingdom has now left the EU, and there is now a gap of 60 billion euros that someone is going to have to fill up. Now, there are countries that will say they don't want to contribute more. They want to cap that at 1% of gross national income. Others that will tell you we all need to put more money on the table, and we don't want to see spending cuts going into this budget. Now, at this hour, there is a compromise proposal that is floating around, but it's unclear whether European leaders will sign up to this, will agree to this. And the thing is, you need to keep into account that there are a number of issues here. You have the North and the South, you have West and East, countries that have different interests. We know that for Emmanuel Macron, getting a good deal on agriculture is very important. That is a very, very big and powerful lobby in France. And then you have Angela Merkel in Germany. This is the biggest checkbook. She needs to be able to go back home and show taxpayers that she's found value for money. But as I mentioned at this hour, it's unclear whether or not we get a deal on this budget.
Okay, Maria, thank you. Terrific for reporting now coming from Brussels. And that's Maria Tadeo. Now let's go down to Washington and Bill Ferries. So, Bill, take me through, because I'm a little confused right now. I saw an announcement that the Taliban in Afghanistan says they're going to have a signing ceremony in front of international monitors on the 29th, a week from tomorrow. What are they going to sign if, in fact, that happens?
Well, they're basically signing an agreement, and that will only happen if we have a 7-day reduction of hostilities between now and then. So that remains to be seen. But they'll be basically signing an agreement to enter some kind of talks with the current Afghan government that would presumably lead to a power-sharing deal or a peace deal that would, the U.S. hopes, allow it to begin drawing forces down much more than it has in recent months.
Yeah, at the same time, that does not automatically mean we withdraw troops, right? Do they have to get the power-sharing deal first?
Exactly. I think the U.S. at this point sees itself holding about 8,600 troops in Afghanistan for the coming months and perhaps the coming year, it does allow a little bit of a drawdown, and I think President Trump will look to tout that accomplishment. But it certainly doesn't mean it's a watershed moment. It doesn't mean the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan is over after almost 19 years. That's still quite a ways away at this point.
Bill, we also have to get your thoughts on this report out of Washington yesterday that there was a behind closed-door security briefing in which intelligence officials told some members of Congress that, in fact, Russia once again was trying to interfere in the elections this year, 2020, on behalf of President Trump. Reportedly, President Trump was none too pleased with that briefing. What do we know about it?
Well, there was a briefing by representatives from the Director of National Intelligence up on Capitol Hill. It does seem that they were asked about Russia's role and essentially responded that Russia continues to meddle in some way. And were also asked whether Russia is how it views the election. And the response appears to be that Russia still would favor a Trump presidency over that of any of the Democratic candidates. I'm not sure the two issues are linked. It's not clear that they are meddling directly to tip the scales in Trump's behavior at this point. That may be a fine line for some, but that's one of the reporting lines we're chasing. But it does, seem that from the intelligence community's point of view, Russia is still very much engaged in some of the actions that first arose online in 2016.
Okay, Bill, thank you so much for your reporting from Washington. That's Bill Ferries, our colleague down there, who reports on national security. And now it's time to get a check on the markets and whether and how they may be reacting to the day's top stories. Joining us now is Abigail Doolittle. So as I look at the equity markets, a second day in a row.
Indeed, a risk-off day, and certainly in reaction to the coronavirus, renewed fears that we have no idea how bad this tragedy could get. The human impact devastating, but what will the eventual impact be on the global economy? We've seen a number of companies, of course, cut their numbers, and we've been talking about this for weeks and months around different events, whipsaws, because there has been some volatility that at the end of the day, it always comes down to that corporate profit outlook. And if there is a view that that is going to continue to be trimmed based on this coronavirus. We have that PMI number coming in at contraction, the lowest level since 2013. Perhaps that coronavirus taking a toll here in the U.S. If investors continue to think that, you're probably not going to have that FOMO. You're going to have cooler heads prevailing. And
I wonder if the bond market may be as important right now. I see the 10-year now is down below 1.5.
Indeed, and the 30-year hitting an all-time low. So investors,
and a flattening of the curve across the board is not good.
Yes, it's going to be interesting to see how all of this plays out. And of course, the Fed, a lot of folks, one of the narratives that we've heard this year is that stocks have continued to climb in the face of all sorts of challenges because the Fed has the markets back. But as we continue to see this tragedy play out and what does happen to the yield curve, bonds continuing to rally, it's going to be interesting to see what does happen. Will they have the ammunition that investors are hoping? But today, again, a bit of a risk-off tone. The first down week this month, in fact.
Yeah, and the Fed can have the markets back, but what do they do about a coronavirus? I'm not sure the Fed can go
we just don't know right now.
Coronavirus. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle for the market check. And now we welcome Mark Crumpton. He's here with Bloomberg First Word News.
David, the United States plans to sign a peace agreement with the Taliban a week from tomorrow. It's intended to end the war in Afghanistan, America's longest ever. The deal is still contingent on a 7-day-long partial ceasefire that begins at midnight. Once the agreement is signed, talks will start between the Taliban and the Afghanistan government. President Trump is looking for a permanent national intelligence director. U.S. Ambassador to Germany, Richard Bryan, is the new acting director, but he's expected to be a short-timer overseeing the nation's 17 spy agencies. The president told reporters Thursday that he's considering Georgia Republican Congressman Doug Collins for the job, but Congressman Collins said today he's not interested. Germany is stepping up the police presence throughout the country. Authorities say they'll also keep a closer watch on mosques and other sites after racially motivated shootings that killed 9 people. A 43-year-old German man fatally shot the victims of immigrant backgrounds in a Frankfurt suburb Wednesday before killing his mother and himself. Police say he left a number of rambling texts and videos portraying racist views. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson sailed through his new government's first major economic health check as he prepares to lead the nation through a potentially bumpy Brexit transition. Several indicators this week, from inflation to retail sales, confirm signs of a so-called Boris bounce, a pickup in growth following the Conservatives' election win. The Treasury is also on track to borrow less than forecast. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks very much, Mark. Coming up here, we look at the Nevada caucuses and then on to South Carolina and Super Tuesday with Lara Brown of George Washington University. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. The next step on the road to the Democratic nomination for president comes with caucuses in Nevada tomorrow, followed in short order by another debate on Tuesday, a primary in South Carolina next Saturday, and Super Tuesday 3 days after that. To give us her sense of the race, we welcome now Lara Brown. She's associate professor and director of the Graduate School of Political Management at the George Washington University, coming to us today from Washington. So, Professor, thank you so much for joining us. Let's start first with Nevada and then move on. With respect to Nevada, explain how important this is in the race. It appears that Bernie Sanders has a commanding lead, according to the polls right now. Is the question who comes in second?
Well, I do think the question is going to be who comes in second. Certainly, Vice President Joe Biden's campaign has talked about him surging and doing well there. But I think we saw in the debate that Senator Elizabeth Warren had a very strong performance. She came out as a fighter. She could very well eat into Senator Bernie Sanders' lead and take some of his vote. And if that is a close race there at all, there will be sort of a shakeup in this idea that Senator Sanders is unstoppable.
Well, that's the question. Unstoppable may be strong, but certainly right now it looks like he's ahead without a doubt. And the question is who can really cut into that lead or catch up with him. What is the best path for somebody actually to keep him from gathering more delegates than anyone else before he goes into Milwaukee?
Well, I think the most important thing is that he has to sort of fare poorly in South Carolina. So the real question is going to be what happens in South Carolina. Bernie Sanders does not have that strong of support among African Americans who are over 45, and much of the electorate in South Carolina is African American and an older electorate. That won't be a very good kind of constituency for him. And then when you look at the Super Tuesday states, you have to realize that there are 6 southern states that vote that day. And those states are not necessarily teed up for Senator Sanders to run the table on. Those 6 states actually have more delegates collectively than California does individually. And so while much of the race has been focused on who's going to lock up California, I would argue that there is a strong chance that Senator Sanders may be locked out of delegates in places like Tennessee and Alabama, where he will need to gather delegate votes if he is going to win this contest.
And how does winning the contest, that is to say the nomination, fit with winning a general election in November? In fact, when you look at, for example, California on the one hand and those 6 southern states on the other hand, I would think that they might go for very different sorts of candidates. What's the candidate the Democrats need to come up with that could potentially beat Donald Trump, which I guess, after all, is the goal?
Well, so I would argue that what the candidate needs to do is build a broad coalition of voters. And that means for Democrats, they have to be able to pick up and show support among all different age groups, and as well as both African Americans and Latino voters. There is not going to be a candidate who wins a presidential race who doesn't have strong support in the minority community, but also strong support among moderate voters or those, especially women, who are living in the suburbs and are college educated.
Is the Democratic Party disserved at all by the fact that we had people of color who were in the race who are now gone? We have 2 women left. But it's surprising we have an awful lot of white men. I'm one of them, so I'll guilty as charged. A lot of white men here vying for the leadership of the Democratic Party.
Well, I think what that is about is that many Democrats are looking back at 2016 and saying to themselves, what did we do wrong. And I think the answer is not that they nominated a woman. The answer is that they failed to reach out to blue-collar workers in the Midwest. And so with that knowledge, many Democrats have said we need to elect or nominate someone who will appeal to non-college educated white individuals within places like Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania. I think, unfortunately, that fails to recognize that there are changing demographics in this country, and the states look very different in 2020 than they did in 2016. North Carolina, Arizona, Colorado, all could very well be in play, not to mention Florida. And when you look at those states, that means you probably need either a person of color or a woman to also appeal to that more diverse electorate.
Well, you make a really important point here, Professor. I'm glad you made it, which is, I understand, I've read at least, that if you had the same proportions of the different groups voting the way they did last time, that in fact Donald Trump would not have won the election because the groups that are growing faster are the ones that he did not do as well among.
That's correct. I mean, I think one of the things that parties fail at is that they tend to always want to run the last war, right? It is this problem where they look back and they say, what did we do wrong? And they don't necessarily look forward or account for how the country is changing, how the electoral college map shifts slightly, and also really who the constituents are that will make up the new coalition. Because it is certainly true that President Donald Trump has not grown his coalition since 2016, and that in and of itself puts him in a serious position of weakness.
Yeah, terribly important point. Thank you very much for making it. That is Lara Brown. She's associate professor at George Washington University and also the author of Amateur Hour, Presidential Character and the Question of Leadership. Still ahead here, it's a car revolution as automakers scramble to catch up with Tesla in the move to electric vehicles. Our colleague Alex Steele is here for a preview of what is to come. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. I'm David Weston. EVs on the brink of change premieres on Bloomberg Television tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. The special explores the future of electric vehicles, the players in the growing space, the path to mass adoption, and the challenges facing consumers and automakers. Here is a taste where Bloomberg's Daybreak anchor Alex Steele spoke to the heads of Peugeot and Ford on coming together to make it in the EV space.
This transformation for the industry is going to be a challenge for many OEMs. It's going to be a kind of Darwinian period for the industry. But hold on, this is going to be bumpy for the next few years.
I think that the notion of any one company going alone into this new future is something that you're probably not going to see a lot of.
Ford and Volkswagen recently joined forces to develop electric and self-driving cars.
The business part of you wouldn't do these things, but that's because the leadership part of you requires that you do it.
Ford will build battery cars on VW's platform, and VW will invest $2.6 billion in Ford's autonomous affiliate Argo AI.
It just makes sense for two big companies to share some of the efforts, which will make both companies faster and more efficient.
Volkswagen and its Chinese JV partner are investing more than $4.4 billion in 2020 to rev up production.
You also immediately have the market to scale up, and it'll allow that group of companies to get faster to market with affordable technology that now may actually give them a little bit of a competitive advantage for a few years versus trying to do it alone.
For more, welcome now Bloomberg Daybreak and Commodities Edge anchor Alex Steele. So congratulations, you worked long and hard on this. And
it was like
beautiful.
2+ years.
I'm really looking forward to it. But of all the things we just heard, the thing that I really heard was bumpy.
Yeah.
The Peugeot heads, bumpy may understate what the car makers are going through.
I agree with you, and you actually did some of those interviews on that string, and bumpy is a definite understatement. I mean, these companies are losing and spending billions of dollars as they are forced to pivot, and they're forced to make these huge projections, like X amount of our car sales are going to be EVs by this year, and they're not profitable yet, and they can't compete with Tesla, and they don't have the technology. That's a very tough spot to be in.
It feels a little like Field of Dreams. You know, if you build it, they will come. Because right now, it's not like there are people who are lining up around the block saying, please give me an EV. They're building them in advance.
And we try and tackle that in the pieces, and like the consumer needs more options in order to buy them. So then the car makers need to make them, but then they can't make them because it's not profitable, but they still need to put the money out there. And I don't know how you solve for that. And no one knows how to solve for that. And that's kind of what we explore.
And isn't the thing that's driving it governments? I mean, China,
100%.
perhaps first and foremost, China?
What we do learn is that without subsidies, sales of these cars fall full stop. No matter what country that you're in, China tried to roll them back, and the car sales wound up falling off a cliff for EVs, and they're thinking about bringing them back or sort of moving them around or extending them a little bit. Singapore, for example, is doing more stuff. Germany is going to consider extending subsidies as well. So without it, it doesn't float. But that doesn't necessarily create a real supply and demand market. You have to wait for that. But when you wait for it, you got to spend the money. You're not profitable.
Thank you so much, Alex. It's such a treat having you here. And it's going to be a bigger treat, actually, to watch that special tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And now we're going to turn to Stock of the Hour. Deere is the best performing stock on the S&P 500 today and is heading for its biggest gain since 2016. This after the company reported a surprise increase in first quarter profit. Kaylee Lyons is here with more, turning us from tractors to cars, I guess is what we're doing here.
Or cars to tractors. So yes, Deere beat, but the fact is it was really low expectations going in that they were jumping over. Earnings per share came in at $1.63. That was 25% above the consensus estimate, and that came despite the fact that across all of their major business segments, sales actually fell, most notably in the financial services division, but also you're seeing continued weakness in that construction and forestry sector, which saw net sales fall by about 10%. And for agriculture and turf, which we know has been struggling for many quarters as farmers amid the trade war have not wanted to invest in that really expensive equipment, revenue did fall 4% in this first quarter. But Deere said, yes, their farmer is still subdued, but the signs of stabilization are there and things are improving, mostly because we do have a phase one trade deal.
And what about coronavirus?
Well, so it's interesting. Deere did not mention it in its statement, but it had to field questions about the virus on the call. They say the impact on sales should be relatively small. The bigger issue is in terms of the supply chain, because its top supplier is based in China. They've had to start making some contingency plans in order to get that freight, get the supply in, should there be any disruptions because of the virus. And then in terms of this trade deal that is driving a lot of that farmer optimism in regard to China's agricultural purchases, that remains an open question. Deere says it's too early to make any kind of call in regard to that.
Open question may be a little gentle right now, because the people we talk to say they're nowhere on phase one. I mean, they're not even thinking about phase one right now. So at the very least, it's going to postpone the possible recovery on their top line, because I understand it, Deere didn't do so well on the top line. It was more in the earnings.
Yeah, it was bad on the top line. Revenues were down about 6% year over year. Again, that beat, but street expectations were pretty low. All the profit that Deere is getting here is because of efforts like offloading their revenue. So they're making some, offloading their inventory, making some revenue off of that. They're also, for example, there's a lot of things that Deere is doing to improve that bottom line, but the top line is still struggling.
Whatever they're doing, they're having a good day today. That's nice. Okay, many thanks now to Bloomberg's Kaylee Lyons. Up next, we talk Nevada caucuses with the man who knows, the state's former senator, governor, and attorney general, Richard Bryan. That's coming up on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. From New York, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, while China still accounts for the vast majority of coronavirus cases, there are now signs infections are spreading rapidly within other Asian countries. South Korea, Singapore, and Japan all have seen their totals climb this week. The epidemic is not yet considered a pandemic. That's defined as a situation where the virus is spreading across multiple continents. So far, the numbers outside China remain comparatively small. Of more than 2,200 deaths, only 11 have occurred in other regions. Iranians are voting for a new parliament today. More than 7,000 potential candidates were disqualified ahead of the election, including 90 sitting members of parliament who had wanted to run for re-election. The election comes at a time of economic uncertainty in Iran. U.S. sanctions have strangled the nation's ability to sell its oil abroad, pushing its economy into recession. President Trump's campaign ads will take over YouTube's homepage on Election Day and a few days before. Bloomberg has learned that the campaign bought the coveted ad space atop the country's most visited video website. About 3/4 of U.S. adults say they use the site. The world is on track to have the warmest winter ever recorded. A stubborn low-pressure system over the North Pole has pulled the jet stream north, backing it up against the fast-moving winds that constantly ring the polar region. The result, a tight barrier that's kept the cold locked in place. If the trend continues, it will set a global high for the season in U.S. records going back 141 years. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks very much, Mark. Tomorrow's the day for Nevada to weigh in on who should be the next Democratic nominee for president, with polls showing Bernie Sanders way out in front, and some people he's raising doubts about whether we might just have a repeat of something we had in Iowa with the fiasco that were the caucuses there. Joining us on the telephone from Las Vegas is Richard Bryan. He served as a Democratic senator from Nevada from 1989 to 2001 and as Nevada governor from 1983 to 1989. He is now director of the Fenimore Craig law firm. So thank you so much, Mr. Senator, for joining us. Give us your sense of where the race is right now. We've seen some polls, as I say, that show Bernie Sanders way out in front.
Well, you know, we don't know the results of the caucus, of course, and won't know that until after the caucus on Saturday. But clearly, Bernie Sanders is surging in Nevada as elsewhere. I think the real winner of the debate, frankly, was Donald Trump. I was, as a Democrat and a strong supporter of Joe Biden, I was very dismayed at the colloquy. It just seems to me that the prize is winning in November. The primary, obviously, is an essential step, but my concern is that some members of our party are moving, I think, further to the left than most mainstream voters in America and most mainstream voters in Nevada, and that's a concern to me.
And a lot of the attacks, if I can call them that, in that debate were directed at other Democrats up on the stage. They weren't directed at Donald Trump. But for that matter, they also weren't directed very much at the front runner. Why isn't it that people aren't taking on Bernie Sanders more directly? When Joe Biden was in front, people took him on. When Elizabeth Warren was in front, people took her on.
Well, I think to some extent, the Bloomberg, this was his inaugural presence on the debate stage, and so he was clearly the focus, and he had been surging in the polls and looked like he may very well be a formidable candidate, still may be, but his performance, I think it's fair to say, even for his most enthusiastic supporters, was disappointing. His response to some of the very sharp inquiries by Elizabeth Warren and others, I think, did not go well for him. Now, this is his first debate, and the others have been doing this for months now, so he may very well right the ship, so to speak, but I think it was a very poor performance on his part, and he was the focus as the new guy on the block, so to speak.
Yeah, to remind people, Michael Bloomberg is the founder and majority owner of our parent company, Bloomberg LP. When it comes to Bernie Sanders, does he have a labor problem potentially in Nevada? We saw some questions from the culinary labor union out there, which is pretty powerful. Does he have a problem because he wants to abolish private health insurance?
Certainly, that is a big issue with the culinary. That is a very big issue, and as you know, they did an evaluation of the various candidates on their stand, and although the culinary has not endorsed any Democrat at this point, clearly the analysis reflected very unfavorably to Sanders and to Warren, who are talking about, Medicare for all. The culinary views its success in its negotiations in terms of the medical care benefits is one of the jewels in the crown of their accomplishment on behalf of their workers. So that is not popular with them, and frankly, I think it will hurt him with the culinary union, which is the largest and most effective political union in the state of Nevada.
So, Senator Bryan, we normally don't spend too much time on logistics, what goes on behind the scenes, but we have to, given what happened with Iowa, those caucuses. And I understand it's not the same. They're not going to use the same app that they used in the caucuses in Iowa. At the same time, we keep hearing some rumblings that people have not been trained properly. There may be some difficulty administratively getting a result out of Nevada, maybe along the lines of Iowa. Is there any truth to that in your opinion?
I don't know at this point. It was a different experience. I will say this, that one, I've been in a number of political campaigns and followed a number in my lifetime. I think it's time to abandon the caucus system. It's very confusing, although for the Democrats, the enthusiastic of this unbelievable. People waited 2, 3, 4 hours in line. Having said that, I think it's time to make a primary. That, to me, is the most effective way of determining how Democrats and Republicans feel about their potential nominees. And I would hope that the Nevada legislature does that next year when it convenes.
Finally, going beyond Nevada, let's go to Milwaukee and the state of the Democratic Party overall, because you are a Democrat. To what level are you concerned about the parties being able to come back together when all of this is over and, in fact, it has a nominee? I'm sure at every time, every 4 years, there's some stage where we ask this question. But we particularly asked the question because of Bernie Sanders and some of his followers, and even the last question on the debate about what would happen if somebody had more delegates than anybody else going into Milwaukee but didn't get the nomination. Could they support him? It wasn't clear that Bernie Sanders would go along with that.
Well, Sanders has said, has each of the nominees, that they will support the winner. I hope that's true. There's a history here, as you point out. There are many who feel that Bernie's people didn't get on board in 2016 when Hillary was our nominee. There's no question there was certainly a lack of enthusiasm for her by the most enthusiastic Bernie supporters. They felt they had been treated unfairly. I think that is gone in this process. I think Bernie cannot contend that he has not been treated fairly. He's leading in many polls, as you know, but I hope that the enthusiasm that his supporters have for him, if he is not the nominee, can be transferred to who our nominee is. Without that, it's going to be a more difficult race in the fall.
So, Senator, final question here. As a Democrat, as you look at the people up on that stage, who do you think would be in the best position to beat Donald Trump, which is, after all, the goal of the Democratic Party this year?
Well, I come from the moderate wing of the party by today's standards, and I think one of the moderate candidates clearly, what we need to keep our base, and obviously many of them are enthusiastic for Bernie and Elizabeth, the so-called progressive wing of our party, but we're going to have to bring in all the Democrats. We're going to have to get a great many independent votes, and there are Republicans that are disaffected with the president. We need that to win. Without that, Donald Trump could very well be reelected.
Okay, thank you so very much. Really appreciate your time today, sir. That is Richard Bryan. He's former Democratic senator and former Democratic governor of the state of Nevada. Coming up here, President Trump reportedly was none too pleased when he heard of a classified intelligence briefing to Congress about Russian attempts to support him in this year's election. We talk with former U.S. ambassador to Russia and dean of the U.S. Diplomatic Corps, Thomas Pickering. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. United States relations with Russia have never been simple or straightforward. But since at least 2016, they've added a new level of complexity on reports of Russian attempts to interfere with the U.S. presidential election. And now, reportedly, intelligence officials have given a confidential briefing to members of Congress that the Russians are doing it again in this year's election. Welcome now a true expert on U.S.-Russian relations. Thomas Pickering served as U.S. ambassador to Russia, as well as ambassador to the United Nations, to India, to Israel, and he holds the rank of career ambassador, the highest in the U.S. Foreign Service. He comes to us today from Washington for today's Conversation in Chief. So, Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for being back with us. We have this report now that apparently what happened in this confidential briefing yesterday is that intelligence services briefed members of Congress saying the Russians are trying to interfere in the elections again. When pressed by Democrats, the report is, they said, who would the Russians favor? They perhaps reluctantly said, well, I think they'd favor President Putin, and that really upset President Trump. But does it surprise you that the Russians may be trying to do this again in some way, shape, or form?
Thank you, David. And no, and you said they might favor President Putin. Obviously, you meant President
yes,
Trump.
I did, yes.
That's perfectly okay. I think two things are true about intelligence operations everywhere by anybody. One is they will constantly seek to find weaknesses and weak points in the posture of the other side. And secondly, they will never admit that they have done so. And I think we have to live with that. That's part of life. It's part of reality. The notion, in fact, that there should be rules about being off base may relate to life and death, and they have in the past. but they don't relate, I think, to kinds of operations that we see going on here. So one, it should be no surprise. Two, I wonder why the president is surprised. Certainly he's gotten his own intelligence briefings from time to time. I hope he listens to them because I think they're important. Thirdly, we should be taking every step we can to prevent this activity. There is no excuse that we should remain significantly vulnerable on this course if that is indeed the case. And I have to tell you, David, the notion that the truth is whatever I say it is a fatal blow to the notion that the United States has credibility, that it speaks the truth, that our campaigns are run on the basis that people can know and discern and understand the truth. And that is an undermining of the fundamental part of our democracy. And obviously it is also the seeds of destruction of the scientific method. I'm very concerned about it.
How does it affect the diplomatic corps from your vast experience as a U.S. diplomat? In the past, has it been the case that the United States has a bit more credibility than perhaps some other nations when we go into foreign courts and make our arguments for what is going on?
I would hope so, but I think once the leadership of the country adopts a different view, and whether that was okay on virtual reality television, it's not okay on real reality, life and foreign policy. And that makes a difference because, in fact, if the problem is from the top, can you trust the people down below in a situation in which they have to speak what is spoken by the top or they have to leave? And that's a very destructive activity, and certainly one because what your diplomats tell you is going on is essential to promote the interests of the United States. And for me, that is very significant. And if your diplomats are pushed into a position where they have to please the boss by what they say, that is in many ways going to be an undoing of successful American diplomacy, and it begins with our credibility.
Let's talk about U.S. interests in what seems, at least to me, a fiendishly complicated situation, which is the situation with Turkey and the northeast of Syria, the Idlib province, what's going on with Syria, and with Russian support there. Reports were out yesterday that, in fact, Turkey has requested two, I think, batteries of Patriot missiles be provided by the United States in order to help it in that conflict, which, as I say, it's Syrian troops, as I understand it, but supported by Russia. Where are United States interests there?
Well, I think United States interests are to do everything they can to make sure that neither Syria nor Russia creates an even more massive humanitarian catastrophe than already exists. And it's something of an anomaly that President Erdogan, who is convinced himself that he must buy the Russian S-400 missile, is suddenly seeking American air defense to protect himself against either the incursions by the Syrian Air Force with Russian airplanes, or more importantly, perhaps incursions by the Russian Air Force, or their use of those air forces in bombing attacks to create massive movements of civilian refugees toward the Turkish border. We all knew that was going to be a problem. It's not a secret, but the idiosyncrasies of the Middle East never ceased to mystify me, and I spent 8 years there almost on assignment watching it, but it grows, and President Erdogan has suddenly wakened up to the fact that the S-400 probably is not the answer to his prayer either, and that he needs something now and more useful from the United States. The United States has been very hesitant to continue to support President Erdogan with military equipment as long as the S-400 buy goes through. So we'll have to watch carefully to see how this works out.
We had the Munich Security Conference this week, and we had our Secretary of State, Michael Pompeo, go over and give his estimate about where the state of the North Atlantic Alliance is. This is part of what he had to say.
I'm happy to report that the death of the Transatlantic Alliance is grossly over-exaggerated. The West is winning. We are collectively winning.
Are we collectively winning, Mr. Ambassador?
I think that that's obviously something of a bit of exaggeration when we have watched very carefully the major pressure by the United States on the NATO alliance to raise, obviously, its contributions to defense but in ways that have not been seen before. And obviously, we see some disintegration in what I would call alliance willingness to, in fact, bear every burden and carry forward in every conflictual area that we would hope we could rely on them more for. So my sense is that we have seen a number of people wanting, in one way or another, to put the alliance back together again in a more serious way. And I hope that would allow it to be happen. Now, Secretary Pompeo is obviously entitled to his own view. I suppose in the words that were echoed in the past by Senator Moynihan years ago, everybody's entitled to their own view, but not to their own set of facts. And so we do need to look at the facts here and see how and in what way they really point to where we're going. But I think the reactions at the Munich Security Conference, more perhaps in the corridors than in public, but nevertheless, with a large number of people there from the reports I have received, indicated there is still deep concern in Europe about the alliance and about the U.S. role there. Anything that Secretary Pompeo and President Trump can do to put that back together again is something not only in the United States' interest, but happily in their interest, and I hope they do it.
One of the pressure points at the conference actually was over Huawei, the Chinese tech giant. And I must say, bipartisan. Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, was over there as well, saying you cannot be dealing with Huawei on 5G. There is a national security problem there. At the same time, the United States keeps threatening to cut off our allies. We tried it with the UK, and it seemed like they sort of called our bluff. What is the best way, if that is our national interest, what's the best way to get that accomplished?
I think the best way and the most useful way, and we aren't there yet, is to have an alternative to Huawei 5G. And while Ericsson and Nokia have been working on it, many have suggested they need U.S. support. There apparently is not yet a U.S. purveyor, a U.S. R&D and tech firm that is ready to come forward with the answer to that particularly difficult question. So countries will go where they see the economic benefits of going. Many of them, I think, would come with us if we had a competitor, particularly a better competitor technologically, and particularly a better competitor in terms of how and in what way the costs were put down to a place where our allies and friends and our coalition of partners here could come forward with us and make that happen. I don't think they want to go that way, but there are forces, obviously, in the market and elsewhere that make it hard for us to take a political stand for something else when the something else is not yet quite clearly on the table.
Yeah, really important point. Thank you so much to Ambassador Thomas Pickering. We're going to have more with him coming up at 1 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Radio. Coming up here, we're going to have more on Huawei and 5G and part of my interview with Ian Bremmer of Eurasia Group. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. At the security conference in Munich this week, U.S. officials, Republicans and Democrats alike, I must say, urged Europe not to deal with Huawei as they move into 5G. On this week's installment of Wall Street Week, Gillian Tett of the Financial Times and I talked with Ian Bremmer, he's founder and president of the Eurasia Group, about a Europe caught in the middle of tech between the United States and China and what the United States might do to advance its interests beyond posing threats to allies.
I certainly believe that the data that Huawei has access to will be made available to the Chinese government as they find that useful. So the strategic alignment, the idea that Huawei is a national champion in the way that Lockheed Martin has been a national champion of the U.S. government historically, at the very least, yes, I do believe that. But more importantly, I think when we talk about 5G, we're not just talking about smartphones. We're talking, as you know, about the Internet of Things. It's the entire data infrastructure around smart cities, anything with a chip in it. And the idea that that would be aligned to a Chinese set of standards as opposed to an American set of standards with our allies, even though it's cheaper, even though it's rolling out more quickly, does strike me as something the Americans need to take very seriously.
Ian, this is what I don't get. Thus far, I've only heard stick. If you don't play our game the way we want, then we're going to cut you off, right?
Right.
Where's the carrot? I mean, part of the problem is, as you said, there's not alternatives in the United States for 5G. Why doesn't the United States invest in Nokia? Why doesn't it invest in Ericsson and things like that, where we could together develop 5G and not need Huawei?
Well, of course, this was the speech that was given by Attorney General Bill Barr, who has a telecom background, among other things, just 2 weeks ago. And he suggested, in addition to some urgent FCC decisions that would need to be made in terms of bandwidth made available to make 5G work, but also the idea that the Americans, a public sector supported consortium, industrial policy, dirty word for most Republicans.
Coming from a Republican government, let's say.
Quite
free markets, hello.
Except Republican governments during the Cold War were very supportive of the military-industrial complex. So what you have Barr saying is we need a military-industrial technological complex because the Chinese are fighting the Cold War very differently. And I understand that, but that's his one speech is not a policy. And you're absolutely right that the Europeans see a lot of money coming from Belt and Road, particularly in the 17+1, the East and Southern Europeans with the Chinese. Even the Italians, right, joined Belt and Road for a reason. The Brits are saying it's a cheaper system. Why are we going to come to the U.S. unless it's something for us? They don't have the companies. So unless we're finding a way to help build up the Europeans as well, it's hard to imagine that they're going to simply say, yeah, we're going to go with you, America First, Trump.
That was part of our talk with Eurasia Group President and founder Arian Bremer on Wall Street Week. The full program airs tonight at 6 p.m. on Bloomberg Television and Radio. It's also available everywhere online. Coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to have more with Ambassador Thomas Pickering talking about Afghanistan, as well as talking about India and the upcoming visit of the president there. Plus, we're going to talk to UNLV Professor Dan Lee about the Nevada caucuses, whether we should really be worried about whether it will go okay. This is Balance of Power, Bloomberg Television, and on radio.